Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices. Our hostess for today's program is Teresa Miller, Executive Director for the Oklahoma Center for Poets and Writers at OSU Tulsa.
Hello, everyone. I'm Teresa Miller, and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very, very special guest today is Thomas Keneally, the author of the international bestseller, Schindler's List. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Keneally.
It's a great pleasure, thank you.
All the way from Australia to Oklahoma.
Yes, indeed. I was chosen for a Distinguished Oklahoma Prize.
Yes, the Helmerich Award.
Just imagine someone from Australia. It's for a body of work. You get it when you're moribund, but it's a great honor. I can't believe the generosity of people from a far place.
Well, the Helmerich Award is a very prestigious award and something that we all honor here in Tulsa and think very highly of. And you mentioned that you are being recognized for a body of work, and so many of us know you for Schindler's List, but you've written over 30 novels, over a dozen nonfiction books, plays. What makes you so prolific?
Well, I think that I have an impetuous nature, and this means that if I start a book, it itches until it's finished. And so it's a bit like getting rid of a bad case of eczema. Of course, it's interesting when writers answer a question like that, they generally make writing sound an agony. But if it was an agony, why would we do it? It is also a transcendent experience.
Even if you have to scratch a little bit along the way.
Yes, that's right. It's a transcendent experience, and we do it for the joy of writing well or being deluded enough to think we're writing well. And we also have a feeling, which is, I realize now that I'm older, is actually a very arrogant feeling that we've got something to tell the world. When we're writing the book, we think the world needs this book. It's only after it's published and you see the sales, you know that as much as the world might need this book, it doesn't think it does. And so I also had solid working people as my parents, and they believed in habits of industry. You know, if you're going to do something, you address it and do it. And I think they gave me a kind of industrial view of writing, that you do, no matter how you feel, you do your so many words, or you manufacture so many bottle tops or toothbrushes every day. So I think they had a big influence on me. My mother is still with us. She's 94, and she still scares me.
Well, I bet she's proud of all of your accomplishments, certainly.
Yes, she is. She takes them rather for granted. Her view is, what did I tell you? I had an old Jewish friend who told me that Schindler would make a great book, and I don't want to drag Schindler into the conversation so early. And he said, when it did well, he said to me, what did I tell you? What did I tell you? When Spielberg did well with it, he said that to Spielberg. What did I tell you? What did I tell you? So my mother's a little bit... there are many teachers that are now turning to dust under the Australian earth that she'd like to dig up and say, what did I tell you? What did I tell you?
Exactly. Who were some of the writers you studied when you were in school that influenced you?
Well, it's funny. I was influenced somewhat in my literary tastes by some American writers like Fenimore Cooper. Fenimore Cooper is the American Sir Walter Scott, and The Last of the Mohicans and Deerstalker I just loved. I liked Sir Walter Scott. I love books like Treasure Island. And I remember there was an old English captain called Captain Marriott who wrote about the 19th century Navy. And he gave his books titles you couldn't give books now, like Masterman Ready and Mr. Midshipman Easy. Midshipman Easy sounds like the name of someone in a porn.
Well, absolutely, but...
And so these all invigorated me in my childhood. You see, Australia and to an extent Oklahoma have these semi-deserty sort of landscapes. So you tend to not to get seasons of mists and mellow fruitfulness and the little delicate European flowers that you get in great literature of the past. You tend to get either a tornado or a beautiful day in Oklahoma. And the blasts of wind and storm are very honest and upfront, like Australian storms. So Australia is in a place of European-style visual subtleties. And you grow up in a place like Australia thinking, this is all great, but boy, I wish I lived in a world where there were these little flowers that the poets are on about. And I think that's why you get writers emerging. They in places like that, they are so anxious to interpret what they think of as their marginal world to the big world, which is more obsessed with dainty little flowers and ornamental gardens and so on.
I'm particularly intrigued by your biography of Abraham Lincoln. What inspired you to write about an American president?
Well, that is from a series of biographies written by fiction writers on figures that they admire. For example, I know Larry McMurtry wrote Crazy Horse, and I think Jean Gordon wrote Joan of Arc. And I was researching a particular American general who had some Australian connections in the library, and he also had a lot to do with Abraham Lincoln's White House. His name was General Sickles, and I was writing a book which was ultimately called American Scoundrel, about Sickles. And I started talking to the editor of this series, a man named Atlas, who is the biographer of Saul Bellow. And I was telling him about some scandals in the White House that Sickles had been involved in that I had been reading about that morning. And I was talking about the psychiatric state of Abraham Lincoln, who was a great depressive, and of his wife, who had somewhere between bipolar and disorder and a personality disorder. And he said, why don't you write a foreigner's version of Lincoln? And so I thought I'd do that and try to write something about the intimate Lincoln, as well as the public one. And I found it a delightful experience. You know, the wonders of the internet. If you wanted to write a biography of Lincoln once, you had to go to the Library of Congress and Springfield and Lord knows where else. But now there are 16,000 pages of Lincoln material on the internet. The Library of Congress is, I don't know where they got the money, but God bless whoever gave it, so that you could live in remote Australia or remote New Zealand and write a passable biography of Lincoln. And that everything's got easier for the non-fiction writer, I believe, since the 80s. And Lincoln, of course, does fascinate foreigners, and because of the tragedy of his life, because of the vision of his life, because of that terrible war. Also, I was fascinated by the fact that his lonely early youth. I was fascinated by the fact that he would be unelectable now, which is interesting.
Yes.
I think it's wrong to rule people out of the presidency because they've had a nervous breakdown. I think that it may well, what they learnt through the process, may well fortify them, as it fortified Lincoln.
That's an interesting insight.
In times of great trouble. And so there were many reasons why I found, I offered to do Captain Cook, who is one of James Cook, the great Yorkshire voyager, Captain Bligh, because you know he was governor of New South Wales in Australia and was subject to another rebellion. The military overthrew him in 1808, so he had these two huge rebellions in his life. And Florence Nightingale, but they said, no, why don't you, since you're working on the life of General Sickles, a version of the life of General Sickles, why don't you write on Lincoln? And that's how it came about.
Speaking of General Sickles in this great book, American Scoundrel, operative word scoundrel, because the general committed murder, among other things. Why do you like scoundrels so much? I can tell you're attracted to them.
Yes, because they're paradoxical, you know. Sometimes they're brave, and sometimes they're virtuous in unexpected ways. I grew up in a very legalistic religion, Catholicism, you know, where you had to go to Mass on Sunday, or no matter how good you'd been the rest of your life, you could go to hell. And I've always kicked against that legalism. I've always been interested in where virtue unexpectedly arises. And it often arises in what preachers might call flawed vessels, like Oscar. But I mean, Sickles was a scoundrel to his death. He is an interesting study in 19th century morality and in 19th century America, but also half the book is about, or as much as I could make it, is about his young wife, who is more or less taken in adultery, a young woman who is infatuated by Francis Scott Key's son or grandson, I forget. Yes, son.
But there's stories within stories.
And Sickles shoots her lover outside the White House. And right outside, I mean, Wolf Blitzer, if he had a murder like that now outside the White House gate, his day would be made.
Well,
but then there was this great trial. And one of Sickles' dream team of attorneys was an escaped Irish-Australian convict who had been a state prisoner in Tasmania, who was one of the Mandelas of his age, who escaped to the US from Tasmania and became a member, a Democrat, a Tammany Hall Democrat like Sickles, then a lawyer like Sickles, and finally a general like Sickles, a Union general. So you see, given that we contributed, our convicts contributed a general to the Union cause, all that weirdness fascinates me. And his young wife, General Sickles' young wife, beautiful and talented young woman, once it was found out that she was the third party in a crime of passion, a murder of passion, she became a sort of shame on a pedestal for the rest of her life. And when she died of tuberculosis, she was very young and very innocent still, in a strange sort of way. And that's what happened to women then. And there are various reasons why it is so, why it was so then. One was the lack of DNA testing to tell whether your heirs were really your heirs or a cuckoo in the nest. Another one was the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. Without antibiotics, the possibility that if your wife had an affair, that she would have an affair with a man who had a sexually transmittable disease was quite high. And so for all those reasons, she became shame on a pedestal for the rest of her life, and tried to live bravely within those parameters. But when the Civil War started and Sickles rose and rose as a Union general, she was not even allowed to visit the wounded. She wanted to visit his wounded, who were many. Sickles interests me too because he's a rare case of an American secular relic. You know, the relics of the saints that used to be such a draw card in Europe? Well, Sickles' leg is in the Walter Reed Hospital. It was taken off at Gettysburg. And he used to take his girlfriends to see it, because his sexual career was appalling, shameful.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that Lincoln sent him to Columbia to see if Columbia would take the freed slaves in the days when Columbia was a true liberal democracy.
We've been talking so far about your nonfiction. Why did you decide to write the true story of Oskar Schindler as a novel?
Well, I tried to write it like Truman Capote's In Cold Blood and Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff. That is a book that has the imaginativeness of a novel, but in which events are accurate, and even conversations are as accurate as I can get. And the reason I did it that way was that all the survivors, it was one of the conditions of their talking to me via my Jewish survivor friend, was that it be accurate. They didn't want their experience misrepresented, and they were scared of two classes of people. Firstly, their own fellow Holocaust survivors, who would find it hard to believe the apparent fairy story of the Nazi savior. And secondly, and above all, the Holocaust deniers. And therefore, when I finished the book, they all got their sections back, and a number of people read it in its entirety. A number of people who were involved in the story, like Leopold Pfefferberg, my Jewish friend who first told me the story and introduced me to the documents, and then Moshe Beisky, who was Schindler's former forger and an Israeli Supreme Court judge. And so it was a weird case of a work that I hoped was literary, but I also hoped that every word in it was historically accurate. And I also submitted it to the characters, either the chapters that involve them or the entire manuscript when I was finished it.
Was there a point, Thomas, during the interviews when you were doing all of your research, and I'm sure you did research on the internet for this as well, and that you visited a lot of historical landmarks, was there a point in all that research when you felt that you got to know Schindler on a personal level?
Yes, I did realize, I did have a sense of what it would be like to go out for a night on the town with Oskar. But then I had many people who knew him and who told me what it was like to go out on the town with Oskar. And I felt I'd met other men like him. But again, what interested me was that he was a fellow who should have been easy meat for the general anti-Semitic propaganda of the time. He was not a metropolitan German. He came from the Sudetenland. He was not a sophisticated, self-reflective man. He was a doer of things. He was intelligent, had a great deal of native wit, and as the film didn't have time to say, he was a member of German military intelligence. So he was no fool, but he should have been susceptible to the general race hysteria of the day, and he proved not to be. Now, I always find it interesting when that happens. You can't predict before a great cataclysm where your heroes will come from. But, of course, he was a flawed hero. As Poldek, my friend, said to me the first morning I met him, I bought a briefcase from him in Beverly Hills. My briefcase was busted and I was going home to Australia. I needed a briefcase. And he said that he was saved by a Nazi, and although he was a Nazi, he saved the man himself and the man's wife, the speaker's wife, from disaster, from death in the Holocaust, and the wife from Auschwitz, one of the women who got out of Auschwitz. But he said, although he's God to me, a saint he wasn't. He was all drinking, all philandering, all black marketeering. Now, writers are attracted to paradox, you know. So that sounded attractive to me, but I never thought I could write the book. Of course, as you probably know, I've said elsewhere that I came not from metropolitan Europe, but from as far as Europeans can be transported. I came from the trailer trash of the Southwest Pacific, the Australians, who are Europeans mainly, although increasingly Asian, and from other countries, but we look in at the great central mystery of Europe and all its hates and factions and so on. And we have sent in my lifetime men to take part in the great European mysteries. For example, my father was in North Africa for nearly 3 years, you know, during that time, even before America was in the war. And so there were some things that qualified me to write about Europe and some things that didn't. My distance, the fact that I wasn't Jewish, so on. Poldek kept on saying, that's wonderful, you don't have an axe to grind. That's one. Go ahead, write it. What did I tell you? What did I tell you? And so I did feel an inadequacy when faced with the task, but on the other hand, I was attracted to the figure, to this ambiguous figure.
Oh, of course. I wonder about the toll it took on you emotionally. I mean, here you are visiting with people who suffered terrible injustices. You're visiting places like Auschwitz. Do you ever leave a book and a story like that behind?
No, you don't. I've been involved in a lot of grim stories, including that one. And it's funny, writers are such opportunistic parasites, and they suck other people's stories out of them. But they think they can take the story in without taking in the ghosts and the dreams and the horrors as well. And you never can. I mean, journalists can't even get away from some stories that they have written in the past. The stories, not only when you claim a story, the story claims you too. And so, yes, it was very involving, it was very depressing, and in a way I didn't think it would be. Even though there is deliverance at the end, it is terrible, and it hasn't stopped, that we, me probably as much as any humans, have this sense of who they are and find it so hard not to declare that other people with a different sense of self are evil.
Exactly.
You know, how
Exactly.
dare they be different? There must be something wrong with their minds, you know. That human tendency has always fascinated me. When I was a little kid, I grew up in a small Australian town, and we have these people in Australia called Aboriginals, or actually the Aboriginals have us, because we've been there for 220 years, and they've been there for, it now looks, getting on for 120. They are the oldest human culture on Earth. It's a hunter-gatherer culture, and it's. I saw them when I was a kid, and I thought, in this town, and I thought, what is it that they are they and I am I? You know, that sort of thing. That's always fascinated me.
We just have 30 seconds left, but we want to get a quick reaction to Schindler's List, the film. What was that like for you?
Well, the film was wonderful because Stephen was always interested in the ambiguity of Schindler, and he conveyed that. Film is always frustrating in that a lot of the best bits in the book have to be left out, even by the greatest director. But I admired him greatly.
Well, it's a wonderful film, and I thank you so much for taking time to be with us, Thomas. Thanks for coming to Oklahoma and sharing with us in this way. And congratulations on the Helmrich Award. And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.